Good afternoon, and thanks so much for joining us today. Welcome to the 15th edition in our webinar series on the convergence of technology and wetland science. My name is Mike Connors, and I'm the Director of Customer Success at Ecobot. Today's topic is the Florida 404 Assumption, Policy, and Practice, and we've got a fantastic panel of experts to enlighten us and to have a dialogue, so we're excited to get your questions and participation from the audience as well. Down at the bottom of your Zoom window, you should see a Q&A button. Please use that to ask any questions that you have, and we'll do a dedicated Q&A section toward the end of the hour. Also note, we're recording the webinar, so everyone who registered will get a follow-up email later this week linking you to the video. Our host today is my colleague with nearly 2 decades experience as a wetland scientist, and also the co-founder and chief scientific officer at Ecobot, Jeremy Schewe. Without further ado, here's Jeremy.
Thanks, Mike, and welcome back, everyone. For those of you who have joined us in the past, this is our 15th webinar that we've been putting on since the pandemic started. This, of course, was an offshoot from an invitation from the Society for Wetland Scientists to participate in a webinar a couple Aprils ago. And of course, that was with a lot of folks based in Florida with the St. Johns River Management District, which is always a good tongue twister. I think I'm really excited to have this group of folks all based in Florida coming together today to share their specific angle and focus within the arena of wetlands in Florida and what we're looking at with the 404 assumptions. So we're going to be taking a nice deep dive in today with Susan Martin, but we also have Heather Mason from DEP and Kerri MacNutt from ECT joining us, but I'll do a little bit more of a welcome and introduction to them here shortly. But first, I wanted to kind of start off things with a recent experience that I had down in Florida when at Marco Island for the Environmental Permitting School. This couple of things came up for me in going down to Florida for this conference. One, I'm going to just be transparent, admit I've always had this aversion to even going to Florida for some reason. And it was interesting, like flying in to Fort Myers and seeing some of the, the frequently talked about red tide out in the Gulf. It wasn't a big bloom, but certainly very present. That was the first time I'd ever seen it with my own eyes, and it really had an impact on me. And I had made the intention when coming to Marco Island to allow Florida to surprise me. Well, Florida surprised me. I have completely fallen in love with Florida in the last couple months with some of the field experience that I got to have down there. And this alligator and the thunderstorm and a lot of the other amazing things that I got to see in the Big Cypress area just really had a very deep impression on me and reminded me of how beautiful our planet is and how important it is to do the work that we're doing to help protect, conserve, and preserve some of the best ecosystems that we have so many functions, both on their own without the anthropogenic needs, but also the ecosystem services they provide to us as people as well. So brief synopsis on what we're going to cover today. Again, I'd like to do a little bit more of an introduction here. We're going to talk a little bit about the wetland data ecosystem. And of course, since I'm working with Ecobot, I'd just like to do a couple minutes introduction in terms of what we are doing. And then I'm going to turn it over to Susan to talk about Florida's assumption. I'm going to make a brief plug for the Florida Association of Mitigation Bankers Conference coming up at the end of September, early October. And then also give a plug for the next webinar. And then we should have a good 15 to 20 minutes at the end of our presentation today where you can ask questions. For those of you who have come in late to our conversation here, if you scroll down to the bottom of the screen, you'll see that there's a chat box and then there's also a Q&A box. If there's questions that are really in respect to the subject material that we're talking about, please submit those on the Q&A. And then while Susan is presenting or while any of the speakers are talking or responding to other questions, I will curate those and present those as part of the QA discussion at the end of our time here together today. So again, here's our panel, and really want to thank Susan Roeder Martin for helping me put this together, and for the folks over at Florida DEP for volunteering. Heather, thanks for stepping up so confidently to help us in this conversation. And then Kerri MacNutt from ECT is here to also represent the consulting side of things as well. And so I will be curating and proctoring that conversation as we move into it. So in short, in brief, the wetland data ecosystem. What am I talking about in respect to that? For those of you who are joining us for the first time, what we're looking at is, of course, we recognize the planet as a system of overlapping ecosystems, one massive ecotone, if you will. But then there's a lot of new software and hardware that allows us to tie things together, from the GIS software, GNSS receivers, the satellite systems that help us place that, and then the field applications that allow us to collect data, monitor, and also prepare things in respect to the long term. And so Ecobot is operating in the space of the field data collection and the mapping. We have a great group of different companies all over the country that are in pretty deep with the utilization of Ecobot for conducting delineations, monitoring, assessments, mapping, et cetera, in respect to WOTUS related projects. And I just wanted to cue things off here with this is always exciting, especially for those of you who return monthly or every other month or so to these webinar discussions. But in terms of projects that are being conducted across the United States in respect to waters of the United States, and just really excited to be able to be a part of this peer-driven business that is shaped in a big way by people like you who are here in attendance. There's probably a lot of you here who are using Ecobot. So really exciting to see where things are going. But what we all showed up here for today is to talk a little bit more about the Florida assumption of the Clean Water Act's 404 program. And so one of the things that I think is most important to tee up is it's easy from someone from the outside, meaning I'm not a resident or a citizen of the Republic of Florida, but I live in the United States, in North Carolina. And what we're looking at here is all these different divisions in terms of jurisdiction over waters in the United States. And so we can see just here, I've pulled out a few bullets. In the far left, what we have is a polygon that Esri holds online that allows you to see what waters of the United States are still jurisdictional in the current by the Army Corps of Engineers. And in the center, we see representation showing where the different district maps for Florida DEP are based. And then, of course, we've got a whole nother enchilada with the water management districts. And so we'll get a little bit more into those complexities and what that means as a part of Susan's presentation here, and then also, of course, as part of the Q&A. So some of the things that we're seeking to tease out in our conversation and our questions today here, like what does this 404 assumption even mean? Susan's going to be touching base into that, and also why it was implemented. In the QA discussion, we're going to talk a little bit more about the effect of the Navigable Water Protection Rule, what that had on the assumption, looking at some of DEP's responses, and what are some of the things that are expected with things to come. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Florida experts, because you all are out in the swamp in respect to this. So I just met Susan Roeder Martin at the Florida Association of Mitigation Bankers Social at the Marco Island. I was going to say retreat, but I guess it's somewhere between a retreat and a conference down at Marco Island this past July. And We hit it off and had some fun, and we've been enjoying putting together this webinar ever since. So Susan, I know you have made some similar presentations like this in the past, so this is a fairly well-oiled machine, but I am looking forward to hearing your presentation today. So I'll allow you to take it away and just let me know when you would like to advance the slide.
Okay. All right. So I am Susan Roeder Martin, and I'm an attorney with Nason Yeager. And I've only been at Nason Yeager for about a year. Prior to that, I was with the South Florida Water Management District, which is one of the 5 water management districts in the state of Florida. And those water management districts worked with DEP on putting together this 404 permit, although DEP was the lead and handled the majority of the work. We still had input into that program, and the water management districts work very well with DEP. So now I do represent clients that seek 404 permits from DEP. And so that's what I will be talking about, the 404 process in Florida. And we're very proud in Florida that we are only the 3rd state in the nation to be granted assumption of the Clean Waterways Act, of the Clean Waterways Program by EPA. And it was a very difficult assumption process. It took a couple of years, but Florida has a very robust environmental program, a very robust set of rules that we're very proud of, which allowed us to be able to persuade EPA to allow us to assume the program. Next. So in Florida, prior to this year, a permit was required from the Army Corps for anything that discharged into dredge and fill materials into the waters of the United States, or what we commonly call WOTUS. In Florida, also, you had to get a second permit from the state, and that permit is called an environmental resource permit, which we abbreviate ERP, and that's what I'll use throughout my presentation. So the ERP permit comes from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection or one of the state's 5 water management districts. And in Jeremy's introductory slides, he had a map up of the 5 water management districts, and you could see in that map that they covered the entire state of Florida. Next. In Florida, we have authority as a state to protect wetlands through Chapter 373 of the Florida statutes. And that statute gives permitting authority to DEP and the water management districts. And the permitting authority is the same for both DEP and the 5 districts. So in Florida, we did not want everybody having to go to both DEP and the water management districts to get a permit. So we entered into an operating agreement. And under that operating agreement, the water management districts process the majority of the ERP permits. But DEP still has a supervisory authority over all the water management districts, and the districts rely heavily on DEP's expertise. Next. So as I mentioned, Florida has a very comprehensive program to protect wetlands and other surface waters in our environmental resource permit program. And in many ways, our state environmental permitting program is very similar to the 404 program. Next. So under our ERP rules, we protect 3 things. The first category of things that we protect are the environmental category, and that's wetlands, other surface waters, and wetland dependent species. And it's this area of our ERP program that is very similar to the 404 program. But the ERP program goes farther than that. The ERP program also protects water quality, water quantity, and flooding. But for purposes of our discussion today, we'll just be focusing on that first prong, the environmental criteria. Next. So the ERP program protects surface waters, and we define surface waters as basically any water on the surface of the earth. So that's very broad. Next. Second, we require a permit for works, and you can't get a much broader definition than the definition of works. So works means all structures, ditches, canals, culverts, and any construction that connects to, draws water from, drains water into, or is placed in or across waters in the state. So it is hard to imagine anything that is not covered by the ERP program. Now, we do have some things that we exempt, but basically it's covered and then exempted. So just about any activity in surface waters is covered under the ERP program. Next. So what's covered under the 404 permit? Well, most of you probably know that a 404 permit is required for any activity that will discharge dredge or filled material into waters of the United States, what we call WOTUS. So we have the new Navigable Waters Protection Rule, and this is the rule at the moment, although it is likely that it will change, but right now this is the rule. We, under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, a WOTUS is considered a territorial sea or navigable water, a perennial or intermittent tributary to those waters, certain lakes, ponds, and other impoundments. And here's where we get broader: adjacent wetlands, which are directly abutting or having a regular surface water communication with jurisdictional waters. Now, the idea of the new WOTUS definition was to make things a little clearer. The 4 categories that I just read to you still are pretty broad, but what the federal government did to help is to set forth 12 categories of exclusion, which are really very helpful to us in figuring out what are WOTUS waters. And these 12 categories include things that contain water only from rainfall, groundwater, ditches, many ditches, not all ditches, and prior converted cropland and waste treatment systems. Next. DEP estimated that the 404 permit and the ERP permit overlapped 85% of the time. So what that meant is that applicants had to go to the Corps and to the state agency and get permits covering the same activity. Well, that was costly to the applicant. It resulted in delays to the applicant, but it also was costly to the state. For the state to issue a second set of permits that's already covered by the federal permit was an additional cost that everybody hoped that they could mitigate. So DEP sought assumption from EPA, and that finally happened in December of 2020 after a very long process of working with EPA to prove that Florida was in a position to adequately protect WOTUS waters. So with that assumption, DEP enacted a new set of state rules designed to provide for 404 state permitting. And those rules are found in Chapter 62-331 of our Florida Administrative Code. DEP also adopted a state 404 Applicants Handbook. And in Florida, we like applicants' handbooks because they set forth basically the roadmap of how to get a permit, the roadmap of what the agency has to look at. And so that's really the very detailed permit requirement document in Florida. And we have documents for many programs that we call Applicants Handbook. This Applicants Handbook is adopted into the Florida Administrative Code. So it is not only a handbook and a guidebook, it is also the law of Florida. It has to be followed by all applicants and followed by the agencies. DEP also entered into a memorandum of agreement with the Corps and with EPA that set forth a lot of the requirements for the assumption, and also DEP also entered into agreements with the wildlife agencies. Next. So despite the fact that Florida got assumption, we still have challenges, and these challenges exist hopefully just in the short run. In Florida, we still have to get 2 sets of permits in most cases. We get the ERP and the state 404. The water management districts issue most of the ERPs, so that means the applicants have to go to the water management district to get their ERP, and then to DEP to get their 404. So still 2 sets of permits. So we haven't solved that problem yet. Also, DEP has a tremendous workload. When the Corps transferred the program on December 22nd, they also transferred 591 pending applications. Now, many of those applications approved jurisdictional determinations, and many of them were almost ready for issuance. I represent one new client who was in the process with the Corps for 5 years. Then the state assumed the permit, and now they're starting all over again with DEP. And the reason why that has to happen is because the state has a new set of rules. The state could not just adopt in total the federal rules. The state had to adopt the new set of rules. So the 404 applicants in Florida have to follow that new set of rules and start from the very beginning of the process. This also means that their projects have to be publicly noticed again. Next. So at some point, we hope that there'll be delegation to the water management districts. When DEP wrote the new state rule chapter, they put provisions in there allowing for delegation to the water management districts. And the new rules actually do allow DEP the authority to apply to EPA for further delegation. The reason why this hasn't been done yet is because DEP first wanted to get this program under control and running smoothly before they asked EPA for authority to delegate it further. Once this further delegation happens, then the permits could be issued by one state permitting agency. So if you go to DEP for your ERP, DEP would also issue your 404. And once the water management districts assume the program from, if EPA allows this, then you would be able to get one permit. Well, you'd still get 2 permits, but you'd go to one agency for the ERP and the 404. Now, there's no table for this, no timetable for this further delegation, because at this point, everybody's still working on getting this program running smoothly. So I would not expect that DEP would ask EPA to allow the further delegation to the water management districts until this program is at a state where DEP feels comfortable making that request. Next. So did the Corps delegate all permits? No, they didn't. The Corps retained some permits, including traditional navigable waters, wetlands adjacent to navigable waters within a 300-foot administrative boundary, which I'll explain in a minute. Mitigation bank and in lieu fee instruments still are issued by the Corps. So if a project is in or will impact Indian County, Georgia, or Alabama waters, it stays with the Corps. And if your project needs a Rivers and Harbors Act permit, the Corps retains it. Or if any portion of the project will discharge to a retained water body, then the project will be retained by the Corps. Next. Okay, so what is the administrative boundary? Well, that's a 300-foot guideline that's established from the ordinary high water mark or the mean high tide line of the retained water. And it marks the adjacent wetlands over which jurisdiction is retained by the Corps. So if any portion of a project discharges into the 300-foot guideline, then the Corps will retain the project that is landward of the boundary line. Next. So you probably figured that that's a little bit difficult to figure out. And DEP and the Corps worked together very hard to try to make this easier for applicants. DEP put together an Applicant's Handbook, which is part of the, an Appendix A to the Applicant's Handbook, which lists the waters that are retained by the Corps. DEP also included some diagrams in its Applicant's Handbook that are very user-friendly, and they assist applicants in determining the administrative boundary. And the Corps also tried to make the process easier by providing DEP with retained water GIS layers. Next. Now, you might be wondering if you could just get your ERP or just get your 404 and then seek the other permit later. No, you have to do concurrent processing. The only time you don't have to do it is when the 404 activities will occur in a later phase of the project that will take more than the maximum permit duration allowed under federal law to complete. If that would happen, then the applicant can apply for the 404 permit later. DEP issued a joint application form, which everybody must use, whether you're applying for an ERP from the Water Management District or from DEP. And if in that application you note that there will be wetlands or other surface waters, it's presumed that you will need a 404 permit. And so if you apply with the Water Management Districts, the Water Management District is going to send your permit over to DEP for 404 review, and the Water Management District will keep the portion of it that pertains to the ERP review. Now, if you know for certain that you do not need a 404 review, you can let the agencies know that. But the burden of proof is upon the applicant to show that they don't need the 404 review. And if the applicant is wrong, then the applicant could be subject to enforcement action later. And until you get both permits, you can't commence your construction. Next. If any part of your project will require a 404, a no permit required verification cannot be issued by the agencies. And the applicant will have to provide DEP with the information to demonstrate that any on-site wetlands are not WOTUS. Next. So our state program also allows for general or regional general permits. And the state general permits are modeled after the 2017 Corps nationwide permits. And these are the projects that have a minimal adverse environmental impact. The notices of the GPs are sent to our state wildlife agency, also to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Tribal Historic Office. And any of these agencies can request that the project be elevated to an individual permit. In Florida, we also have 7 regional GPs that were assumed by DEP. Next. Okay, so individual permits. Individual permits require public notice within 10 days after the project is declared administratively complete. And your public notice is provided to adjacent property owners, interested parties, potentially affected states and tribes, and other affected agency. DEP posts the notice on its websites. And there's typically a 30-day permit comment period where anybody can request a public meeting on the individual permit. Next. There still is the potential for an EPA review. EPA automatically reviews certain categories of activities, and that review period will begin on the first day of the public notice. EPA also sends notice to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NIMS, the Corps, and then collects their comments and sends them to DEP. Within 30 days of the public notice, EPA must comment, advise that it intends to comment, object, make recommendations, or reserve its right to object. So you don't get a firm decision from EPA within the 30 days unless they tell you that they have no interest. Otherwise, they're able to keep it open. Next. What if you have an existing 404? Can you modify it with the Corps, or do you have to go to the state? Under the MOA that DEP entered into with the Army Corps, the Corps does retain the authority to process minor modifications. But if the modification is not minor, then it has to be processed by DEP as a new permit. If you have a delineation, your delineation now must be under Florida rules. DEP cannot accept your federal delineations. We have to use our own Florida methodology that's found in the Florida Administrative Code. And if you get a modification to a long-term Corps permit, it is limited to 5 years. Next. So what are your mitigation requirements? Well, you still need to mitigate for both your state and your federal impacts. And you still can purchase mitigation bank credits from a mitigation bank that offers state and federal credits. DEP follows the mitigation hierarchy from the federal 404 permit. But this hierarchy can be overridden if there's mitigation which is environmentally preferable on a watershed approach. And that was true under the federal rules as well. So I have one project now where they want to do on-site mitigation, and DEP's first answer was, well, what about the mitigation hierarchy? But when they looked at it, the project was offering 1,000 acres of on-site preservation and enhancement. And so DEP decided that, yes, that is a watershed approach. The location where the mitigation will occur was in a very significant location. And so in that particular case, DEP said that it was acceptable to override the mitigation hierarchy. Next. If a project will take more than 5 years to complete, it becomes a little bit more complicated because state 404 projects are limited to 5 years, and that's because they're limited under federal law. So if a project will last more than 5 years, you may have to divide the project into 5-year phases, where each portion will last 5 years. But even though you're dividing it into phases, you still have to submit a complete application to DEP for any reasonably related activities. And DEP has a long-term planning document that they ask you to use, and that allows them to review the entire project at once, even though portions of it need to be issued in phases. Next. There also is opportunity for a listed species review. So applicants have to provide, when applicants have to provide a listed species review, when a listed species may be effective, affected, then DEP will provide the information to our state agency and also to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And DEP will request review and comment from them. DEP and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service entered into a process where they can get technical assistance through a programmatic biological opinion. And our state agency and the federal agency collaborate on their review. FWC, our state agency, will consolidate the state and the federal review into a comprehensive response to DEP. So DEP only has to deal with one set of responses with regard to listed species. Next. Okay, so now I guess I will be turning it over to Heather, who is the real expert on the 404 permitting, because she is the person who was one of the backbones at DEP putting this program together.
Right, thank you, Susan. Certainly appreciate everything you were able to share with us here today. We'll segue over here into conversation. We've got some great questions starting to come in on the Q&A channel. So those of you in participation, please submit your questions there so that we can try to answer those in the time that we have remaining, which we have about 25 minutes. So we should be able to cover some good ground here. Before we jump over into that, just want to talk a little bit about what's next. So first and foremost, I mentioned this earlier. If you want to continue being a part of this conversation around where things are going, highly suggest attending the Florida Association of Mitigation Bankers annual mitigation banking workshop at the end of September in Jacksonville. I know they're going to also have some online options for those of you who do not want to travel or cannot travel, but certainly worth joining in on the conversation. I will be there and participating and helping proctor one of the sessions on Friday morning. Also, just want to put in a plug for our next webinar, which will be in early October. We're looking at the wetland fringe as we get into the estuary systems. We're going to be joined by Dr. Catherine Schoenrock from Galway in Ireland, who's going to be talking to us about sea kelp forest, remote monitoring and sensing, as well as, well, I guess we can't say boots on the ground like we would for most of the sites that I work on, so we'll say flippers in the water. So looking forward to hearing from her and about this estuary ecosystem that is at the edge, especially when we're thinking of terms of things in respect to climate change. Where are our wetlands and our wetland fringes? How are they going to adopt and adapt to things as they come? So I'm going to go ahead and close out the presentation portion of this for the evening or for the afternoon, wherever you are, and we'll go ahead and move into the QA discussion with our panelists. So let me go ahead and jump out here. We should be able to see everyone. So yeah, really interesting topics here, and exciting to have Florida be the third state to assume the 404 regulation. And so I kind of want to start off by addressing a question to Heather, and then probably also to Susan. But one of the things that I became very aware of when talking with Tim Rauch and a few other folks with DEP when down in Florida was that the impact of the new Navigable Waters Protection Rule of 2020, what that had on DEP's assumptions of making the assumption of the 404 and what that would look like. So Heather, would you start us off with that, please?
Sure, no problem. So one of the things that we were required to do in our package that we submitted to EPA was to estimate the number of permits that we would be processing each year under a state 404 program. So the way that we did that is we asked the Corps for their permitting data, and we took on average per year how many the Corps had processed, and then assumed that we would be processing about the same number. So towards the end of our process, in 2020, as most of you are aware, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule came into effect. And what that did was, because it's significantly less protective than the previous version of the WOTUS definition, it caused people to ask the Corps to re-review some of their permits based on the new Navigable Waters Protection Rule so that they could reduce their impacts and reduce their mitigation costs. And so the Corps had that extra workload, and once we transferred in December of 2020, that extra workload got transferred to us. So we're still working through that. A couple of the ways we're dealing with that is we've been trying to get new positions available. We've been hiring and training new staff. And then recently, to add on to that backlog, the EPA filed a remand of the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, which they say could come into effect as soon as possibly November. So now that everybody knows that the Navigable Waters Protection Rule could be remanded, or it'll go away and we'll go back to the 2015 rule, that's prompting a lot of people to come in for their permits quickly. So we have a backlog and now we're getting a rush, and that's affecting our workload and also our times to process.
Susan, you want to add anything to that?
Well, yeah, applicants are pretty frustrated with the process because it is a slow process. But as Heather said, there's just so much being imposed upon DEP, and DEP took 591 permits over in one just big dump of documents to DEP. So it's kind of a situation where people are going to need to be patient, which is very hard to do when they have a lot of money on the line with their projects. But I other than exercising patience, I just don't see much of a way out of it right now.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. I seem to remember Tim at one of the he was giving a presentation on UMAM at Marco Island, and one of the things he talked about was the number of permit applications currently in Florida. I mean, I seem to remember was it like 2,500 applications? I mean, where are we at with that, Heather?
I don't know the exact number as of right now, but that's around the last number that I heard.
Yeah, and then there's then what? So you guys had all of the ones that were passed over from the Corps, almost 600. Is that including that, do you know, or you don't know that either? But either way, that's a lot of permit applications. And I think it really does tie back to this, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. And, I'd be interested in hearing from Kerri, like what is, from the consulting side of things in trying to move the ball forward on obtaining permits, like what are you seeing on your side? What's your experience with it?
One of the challenges with, consulting, especially the last 6 months, has been, we're used to, our clients asking us questions and having, somewhat definitive answers, how long is it going to take me to get my permits, et cetera. And, with the last 6 months and everything kind of still being a moving target and work in progress, we haven't been able to give clear answers on timeframes and things like that. And I quite frankly got to the point where I was telling them, what I tell you today is probably going to be different tomorrow. And I'm sure you guys all know, just even internally, DEP and water management district staff, I think some of their internal guidance they were getting was changing daily sometimes. So that's been a challenge, but I've just told them you need to plan way ahead and expect that it's going to take longer. And, eventually we'll get to a point where it is a more streamlined process, but until, I think until the agencies get the staff and the resources they need and sort of iron out the kinks and get caught up on all the backlog of, like Susan said, all the applications they got transferred over to them. I think, it's just going to take some patience until we get there. But one thing in particular I'm seeing is just even in terms of getting agency staff on site, even just water management district, that in itself, before 2020, it used to be that you'd submit an application, and generally speaking, you could get water management district staff out on site for review within 4 to 5 weeks after you submit an application. Now what we're seeing is it's taking probably around 3 months to get water management district staff out site, and even longer for DEP in some cases. So that in itself kind of like almost creates a 3-month delay. So I kind of tell my clients, whatever you would normally anticipate for permitting, add 3 months to that. But the other thing, you can really do actively, I think, as a consultant, is try to be proactive and look at the project, look at ways where you can sort of steer and navigate for them to try to make it more streamlined. And when I say that, one example might be, maybe you have a project site that has a lot of isolated wetlands that would definitely fall into the category of non-WOTUS, and maybe it has also some WOTUS wetlands on there. So if you can sort of steer them to avoid the WOTUS wetlands, and you'd still have to go through the DEP process in terms of doing WOTUS determination, that sort of thing. But those are ways where you could kind of help steer them to streamline some of that 404 permitting process. Another thing I would say is similarly, if you apply for one of the state 404 general permits, which are basically more or less captured what the nationwides used to be, and the impacts are under half an acre, et cetera, that can definitely streamline the permitting for sure, as opposed to having to go through a full-blown individual permitting process, which can take, easily 9 months to a year, maybe more, depending on your project. So those are just some things, I would put out there, just trying to be creative and proactive and look at projects differently. And then eventually, as things kind of smooth out, things will kind of start to pick up pace.
And so one thing, go ahead, Susan.
I just wanted to add something on the environmental resource permits. So under the environmental resource permits, we have state rules that require the permits to be issued within a certain time frame. However, if you also need a 404, you can't begin your activities on the site until you have both permits. So in most cases, when applicants need both permits, the agencies are asking the applicants to waive the permitting timeframes for the state permit. And the reason why it is suggested that the applicants do that is because if some changes need to be made in the application to reflect what's needed under the federal permit, you'd have to go back in and modify your state permit if you don't waive the timeframes. But that's certainly something that's within the authority of the applicant to do or not do. But when the time frame is waived, it also means that the state permit is being issued. It's taking a longer time for the state permit to be issued as well as the federal permit.
And so speaking from outside of the Florida theater here, we're seeing significant upticks in permit applications all across the country for the same reason, the Navigable Water Protection Rule, and the likelihood that that's going to be remanded, as we have spoken to. One of the things that has been helpful with a lot of the projects that I've been witness to in the last, well, let's say during this field season, is that it's been a lot easier to get projects to move forward, to get concurrence, to get the permits by reducing the impacts or by avoiding impacts entirely. Now, again, one of the things of flying into Florida that I kind of joked with some of my coworkers back at the office is that Florida is a wetland. When looking at, so Kerri, this is kind of addressed to you, like how difficult is it for you to work with your clients to move them in the direction of potentially avoiding impacts?
I've had success with, I will say, some of my key clients that I've worked with for years, and they understand wetland permitting and understand what it used to be and kind of what it's evolving into. One of the challenges has been new clients that don't necessarily understand wetland permitting and what it looked like before. But generally speaking, I think our clients, our key clients especially, really are open to advice in trying to figure out how to approach a project to create a more streamlined permitting approach. But inevitably, sometimes that doesn't always work because, they can't stay under a half-acre, threshold or something like that for whatever reason. So I think it's really just a case-by-case situation, depending on the client and project. So.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go back over to Heather. We've got a question coming in from Sarah Corbet, it looks like. She's asking, how will the handoff to the water management districts be implemented? And is there a time frame that can be shared in respect to that?
Sure, there is no time frame yet for that, but we did write the rule to be flexible, as Susan stated, so you'll notice if you read the rules, it says the agency shall instead of the department shall, and that's because we anticipated that in the future we would end up delegating to the water management districts. But in order to do that, we would have to put together a new package and submit it to EPA, which would include information about staffing and workloads of all of the water management districts, and our anticipated number of permits that we would be delegating. And that would take some time to put together. And then EPA, of course, would have to review and approve it before we could do that. So once we decide to move forward with that, it'll probably be at least 6 months to a year before we get all the final approvals.
Okay, so that's a great pivot point for me that I'm curious about. When I hear Susan or Tim talking about the handing over of 591 permit applications, and some of these that have been underway for years, and some of those having to start over again. I'm really curious about if we go back to the 2015 rules or something similar to that. Susan, from your perspective, also Heather, from your perspective, do you think that there is a likelihood that some of those permits would then have to start over again?
All I can say is I sure hope not.
Yeah.
I don't have a crystal ball, but I sure hope not.
Yeah,
So I can kind of address that. If we have anything that's in-house that has not yet been issued, we would have to re-review it under the new or the old WOTUS rule, because we would not be able to issue it under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, which is a big reason why people are rushing to get permits right now, because they know that once that window closes, it's not going to open back up. If you have a permit that was issued under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, that permit will remain valid until it expires. But at that point, if you need to come in for a new permit, we would need to look at it under the navigable or under the whatever definition of WOTUS is applicable at the time.
okay, yeah, and that makes sense. I guess, yeah, there's a lot of different directions I could go with that, but I think I'm going to pause on that and then go to an easier question that maybe will kind of stimulate it again. So someone was in the question and answer box sent in a question asking, following this assumption by Florida, and I'm assuming maybe this is someone that doesn't do work in Florida, and so this maybe be helpful for other people to understand it too. What are the procedures now for nationwide permits on the assumed waters? Are the pre-construction notifications sent to DEP now or to the Army Corps of Engineers? Both? What's that look like? And I don't know if you want to start with Heather.
Sure. So what Susan was saying before is that in the State 404 Program Applicants Handbook, there are some maps that help applicants determine if their project is within retained, which means the Corps will process the permit, or assumed waters, which means DEP would process it. So if you look at that and you determine that your project is within assumed waters, then you would submit the application for a general permit to DEP using DEP's application form. If the project is in retained waters, then you would send it to the Army Corps.
Okay. Kerri or Susan, you want to add anything to that?
The only thing, this is Kerri, the only thing I would just say, when you mentioned the nationwide, the DEP did, with the 404, they do have their own versions of essentially the nationwides, but they're called 404 general permits now. That I think, I didn't go through every single one, but I think for the most part, they captured all of the nationwides. So there's still, for example, like the nation or the general permit for residential that allows up to half an acre of impact to WOTUS. Just an example. So you kind of, would follow that same sort of criteria. There's also a state 404 handbook that Susan mentioned on one of the slides that kind of talks about all that content that goes into the 404 permitting, which is, similar to what we were dealing with, obviously, with the Corps. So.
Great. Susan, anything you would like to add?
Kerri was just mentioning the 404 handbook. If somebody has a question about anything on the program, in the 404 program, the first place that I would go to look is the 404 handbook, because it really spells out everything very well. And DEP tried to spell it out in a manner that is easy to understand. And as I mentioned, in Florida, we like our 404 handbooks. The ERP program has a 404 handbook as well. And basically, in the ERP program, that's existed for many years. Anytime that a situation would come up where it was a continuous situation where there was some ambiguity, that ambiguity is addressed in the 404 handbook. So that's an invaluable tool if you're going to practice in this area. So I would read that several times because it will really help you to understand the program.
Great. Thank you. So next question is coming from Sarah Lewis, and she says she's scoping out a project and spoke with someone at DEP about the new 404 process. And he mentioned he didn't think an ERP would be needed through the particular water management district that her project was in. And so her question is, what determines whether an ERP is not needed, but a 404 would be? So Heather?
Sure. So that should be a very limited circumstance. The only times when you might not need an ERP, but you would need a 404 are for those projects that qualify for an ERP exemption, where there's not an equivalent exemption under the 404 program. So that's the only case. Otherwise, you would need both an ERP and a 404.
Anything you'd want to add, Susan?
Well, the exemptions, if for the person who asked the questions, the exemptions, there's some exemptions set forth in 373. There's also exemptions set forth in the rules that DEP adopted. And so if you have a question, just look at those exemptions and see if you can fit your project into one of those.
Okay, great.
This is great. Sorry, I would just one other thing I would add. I think there would be more likelihood that you would need an environmental resource permit as opposed to a 404 permit, because if your site has wetlands and surface waters, ditches, et cetera, that be claimed by the state, and you're impacting or doing any work in any of those areas, then unless it qualifies for an exemption, you'd probably have to fall under some sort of state permit. But maybe they're not waters of the US, so you wouldn't need a 404 permit from the DEP. So.
Yeah, I totally agree with Kerri on that. It's much more likely that you'll need an ERP than the 404.
So I'm going to try to squeeze one more question in. If anybody needs to drop off right at 1:30, thank you. But this one seems pretty interesting too. Christy Mower is asking about if 404 impacts won't happen for years, and they can start development outside of WOTUS related projects. It was also mentioned in your talk, Susan, that they can't move forward unless they have both permits. So would you kind of tease that out a little bit? And I think maybe some clarity around that might be helpful.
Okay, so if the impacts to the WOTUS waters won't occur, then what might have to happen is the project might need to be developed in phases, because your 404 permit will only be for 5 years. So you might have to do phases where you do the part that will have the ERP permit issued right away. And then the second phase would be ERP and 404. But you'll have to submit the information for related activities when you submit your application to DEP, because they'll want to see everything all at once. So Heather may have more to add to that.
I do, and this is one of those tricky questions. So right now we have a limitation of 5 years. So hopefully, if Congress changes that, which we're hoping that they do, we could in the future potentially be able to issue for longer, and then we would be able to do a permit that would cover the ERP and the 404 at the same time. Right now, though, it's true that if you are doing a subdivision and the 404 jurisdictional work won't happen until a later phase, you can apply for that phase later. However, if it's an individual permit, would still need to provide an alternatives analysis. And just the fact that something has been previously constructed does not mean that it can be considered the only alternative. So what we recommend is that if you have a project like that, reach out to your local DEP district office for a pre-application meeting, or maybe include the DEP district office in any pre-application meeting that you have with the water management district, to kind of guide you in the right direction as to whether or not that future phase is likely to be permittable.
Great. Kerri, anything you would add?
No, the only other thing I would really add is that I think most people understand that DEP cannot issue the 404 permit unless the state water quality certification has been issued. So that's something you definitely want to keep in mind. And obviously you want to make sure that, you know, your application under review by both agencies is capturing the same project area. Because if for whatever reason they're a little different, you know, you might get tripped up at the end if you don't end up getting water quality certification to cover the area needed for your 404 permit. So
thanks for bringing that up, Kerri, because we have seen a couple of projects like that where what we get at DEP is different from what was permitted through the water management district. And we do end up having to ask for either new dwellings or a modified ERP. So that was a really good point.
Great. So we are a little bit past our time, so I want to kind of be respectful of everyone's time here and move things to a closure. But Heather, last question for you. DEP is still hiring, correct?
Yes, we are. So
right.
Anybody interested,
yeah,
check out People First.
There you go. So looking for staff to help ramp up capabilities with DEP. I saw that there was an article this week that came out from, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, saying that people were working 2 jobs secretly since they were working at home. So for those of you consultants who need more work for DEP too. Anyways, please, you know, so anyways, that wanted to leave you all with that. And also, you know, again, from our side of things, helping to host here at Ecobot, you know, one of the questions from some of our customers recently has been, can we use Ecobot in Florida? And will that help with speeding up our process and filling out all this paperwork? And the answer is yes. So stay tuned for more, and we'll look forward to seeing all of you at the next webinar. And have a great day. And Susan, Kerri, and Heather, thank you so much for participating in this with us today, and love to give each of you a moment if you want to make any closing comments. We'll start with Susan.
I just want to thank everybody for spending the time to be with us today. And for those of you who submitted questions, we really appreciate it. And I appreciate our other panelists as well.
Great. Kerri?
thank you. And note, just wanted to say thanks again for having me, and look forward to more opportunities to be on panels like this. So
Great. Thank you. Heather?
Thank you all for joining, and thanks for your great questions. And we look forward to working with you all to improve the program into the future.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time here on the Ecobot webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.